Namaste and welcome to Nepal Conversations. In this podcast series, we will talk to scholars and researchers about the interesting work on various aspects of Nepali society. We ask them to reflect on old and new problems, challenges, and possibilities confronting Nepal. The theme for Nepal Conversations' first season is disasters. We will present a series of conversations on the topic of disasters and what it means for Nepali society. This series is supported by Levium Trust.
For this episode of Nepal Conversations, we are pleased to welcome Michael Hutt, who is an emeritus professor of Nepali and Himalayan studies at SOAS, University of London. The study of modern and contemporary Nepali literature is Hutt's home ground, and he is well known as a translator. He has also published on Nepali and Bhutanese politics, the Nepali diaspora in India, Nepali media, Nepali art and architecture, and the Bhutanese refugee issue. From 2017 to 2020, Professor Hutt was the principal investigator for the project After the Earth's Violent Sway, the Tangible and Intangible Legacies of a Natural Disaster, funded by the Global Challenges Research Fund through the Arts and Humanities Research Council. In this episode of Nepal Conversations, we'll mostly talk about his research and collaboration as part of the SWAY project.
Welcome to Nepal Conversations, Michael, and thank you so much for joining us today. You have been studying various aspects of Nepali society and the Himalayan region for more than 3 decades now. What are you currently working on? What are your recent projects?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be contributing to this great series. As you probably know, I took early retirement from SOAS, University of London, last September after 33 years. So I'm currently in the process of sort of reinventing myself as an independent researcher, and I'm doing a number of things. One of the things that Nimeshji is aware of, because he has a chapter in the book, is that we've just finished the editing work on a major study of the aftermath of the 2015 earthquake in Nepal, which will be published this month by University of Cambridge Press, Cambridge University Press in Delhi. So that's been put to bed. I'm now working on a new project, which is a little strand of the project that Krishna Adhikari and David Gellner are running from Oxford, called the Dalit Struggle for Dignity. And I'm looking at Dalits in Nepali literature, in the sense of, on the one hand, the ways in which Dalits and the Dalit issue has been presented and dealt with by non-Dalit writers throughout the history of Nepali literature, and also more recently the kind of writings that Dalit writers themselves are producing. So at the moment I'm doing a thematic analysis of a poetry collection called Afar that was published by the Samata Foundation, and it's extremely interesting. I've also found some great Nepali Dalit poets on Facebook. So when it's possible to go out to Nepal, that will be my next piece of field work. And in September Penguin will be publishing my translation of Buddhisagar's novel Karnali Blues, which has been a long time coming. And that will be a lot of work over the next few months, I imagine. So I'm quite busy.
Yeah, that sounds like your plate is quite full. Since our series, this particular series, focuses on disasters, and much of your research has, for the last 3 decades or so, has looked at Nepali literature or literature from Himalayan region in general. We wanted to ask you about your SWAY project, and really what motivated, what was the personal or intellectual motivation for you to start that particular project? If you could also reflect a little bit on your motivation in starting that project. Yeah.
Sure. Well, it was, I suppose, the first impulse was really a personal one, which was just the shock of what had happened to Nepal in April 2015, and concern for a country that I love, and an urge somehow to contribute to resolution of those problems and to its recovery. And I think also as an academic, there was a little concern also that this would presage a lot of people working in Nepal, doing research, who hadn't worked in Nepal before, perhaps, the kind of disaster studies world, and also all the people who would be moving into Nepal or becoming active within Nepal in the reconstruction process, that maybe didn't have the knowledge of Nepal that we felt would be useful, so that we as a group of researchers, because this was very much a team project, should now sort of try and move in and work as a part of that, and contribute to a conversation within Nepal about the recovery and the reconstruction. And in the course, shortly after the earthquake in Nepal, I read Edward Simpson's excellent book on the political biography of the 2001 2000 Gujarat earthquake. And I thought it would be really fascinating academically to see whether the same kinds of processes that he describes, political and sociological processes, might also, work themselves out in the Nepali context. So that was the real sort of motivation for it. The feeling that the research effort should involve people who weren't necessarily disaster studies experts in the first instance, but were people who had worked either Videshis, foreigners who'd worked in and on Nepal for many years, or Nepali researchers who obviously had that contextual understanding from the start, that we should make a contribution to understanding and resolving some of the problems that the earthquake had created.
Thank you very much. That was really, really interesting. You mentioned about your publication, the co-edited book, Epicenter to Aftermath, Rebuilding and Remembering in the Wake of Nepal Earthquake 2021, the book that has been published by Cambridge University Press earlier. Could you tell us about its main findings? What are the main takeaways from the book?
Oh gosh, yes, I knew you were going to ask me this question. I think findings suggests to me a kind of list of bullet points, and it's not really that kind of book. It's a much more discursive text. There are 15 chapters. There are 33 authors and co-authors, half of them Nepali, half of them Videshis. I mean, we've all stressed, I think, in all our chapters, all the contributors, the importance of properly understanding the endogenous response to a disaster, because I mean, there's the number of scholars have commented over the years in the way in which often academic work on disasters and disaster aftermaths is much more focused on the external intervention, the external perception, rather than from the sort of the ground up. So we've tried to shed critical light on a number of particular issues. One thing that's emerged, I think, is the stress that's being put in work by Jeevan Bania on the one hand, and Stephanie Lotter on the other, about shortcomings in the way in which reconstruction was entered upon without perhaps the level of consultation with the affected communities that you would wish to see, and therefore solutions being found to problems that weren't necessarily the problems that were foremost in the minds of those so affected. So the importance of, that's in the context of domestic house reconstruction, the work that Jeevan did with a Marji community in Sindhupalchok, and also in the context of the reconstruction of heritage sites and cultural sites that Stephanie Lotter was doing in and around Hanumandoka and the Kasta Mandap. We did some interesting work, particularly John Welpton and Mark Lichty, on historical consciousness and continuities and discontinuities between the Nepal experience of earthquakes in 1934 and 2015. So trying to give the issue some historical depth rather than looking at it just in the moment. And I looked at what I called endogenous responses in popular cultural production, in poetry, in music, and also what the disaster seemed to be revealing about the structure and the nature of the Nepali public. And then finally, Sarah Tamang and I have both looked at the earthquake's impact on the constitutional process in Nepal, so its impact at the level of sort of national politics. So those are, whether they're findings or not, I'm not sure, but those are the kinds of angles we've taken on the issue. The sort of core members of the SWAY team. The book also contains contributions from much wider range of researchers working on the aftermath.
Thank you so much. That's really interesting. You mentioned like it's 33 chapters contribution in the book, right? I mean, and it's half Nepali and half BDC scholars. That's a huge undertaking. Like, what was it? Could you talk a little bit about the process of bringing together, like the researchers from very different background working on a project? What was it like to do this? Like, could you reflect a little bit on the maybe perhaps some challenges of doing
it's something I like doing, and it's something I've done before. I mean, looking back to the book we did on the Maoist conflict, the Himalayan People's War book, which is actually incidentally being reprinted in Kathmandu. That was bringing people together around a table in the first instance and exchanging views and presenting papers and getting into a debate. And I really like that mixture of foreign and Nepali. I mean, I think it's those sorts of debates now are much more balanced than they were 20, 30 years ago, where the foreign voices were much louder, and the Nepalis tended to be informants towards informing the foreigners, whereas it's a much more even playing field now. There's a much healthier, I think, relationship academically on sort of between those two constituencies. So yeah, I mean, as you know, Nirishti, because you were involved, we had a conference in London on earthquakes in South Asia, jointly convened by the SWAY project and the SOAS South Asia Institute, in which the Nepal focus was quite dominant, because that was the most recent, I suppose, and also I was involved in convening it and inviting people whose work I was interested in. So the idea was to get people together, within that conference, plus the SWAY project, plus the other conversations that we were having with people around the world and in Nepal particularly about that. So it's quite exciting to get a community of scholars together, all focused on a range of interrelated issues, and try and get a sort of a whole view. So there are 33 authors and co-authors. Some of the chapters are co-authored by 5 or 6 different people. Some of the chapters are single authored, but in total it's 33 authors, and it's roughly half and half. I mean, the editing was quite a task, as you can imagine. I mean, it's in English, but the people who wrote these chapters had a variety of different languages as their first languages. So this sort of standardizing style and the sort of copy editing was quite laborious. Not that they wrote badly; they all wrote very well. But we had to standardize language across all the chapters. So the kind of the spade work of getting it into print was quite a big task. But I hope you will agree when you see the book that it was worth it.
Yeah, totally. I had an opportunity to also contribute a chapter, and
I know,
as you know, but it was very seamless in the way like things work and the way you handled it, and along with other editors. But I'm sure there's a lot of, like, as you said, kind of work that went into making that happen. And thanks and congratulations. Many congratulations.
There were a few seams, but I must say that Mark Lichty and Stephanie Lotter, my co-editors, were great to work with, and together I think we pulled it off pretty well.
Sure. Yeah. To follow up on a little bit on the your specific publication, because you work with other colleagues, but also you've had some publications from this project your own. So we were reading one of your publications that came out in the journal Conflict, Security and Development, where you engage with the topic of change and continuity, or status quo in post-disaster Nepal. One that relates to the promulgation of the new constitution immediately in the wake of the earthquake and the controversies it generated. Then you also looked at the sort of different forms of nationalistic sentiments and values that were expressed in the rebuilding of the Dharara Monument, which came out in your Journal of Asian Studies. And you may be following the news. It was recently inaugurated by the Prime Minister,
Yes.
which again sparked some controversy.
Yes.
So basically, from what our interpretation of these different pieces, is that you're kind of highlighting the complicated nature of the political change induced by a disaster. And I would like to quote in one of your publication, you mentioned in your own words, I would argue that the disaster was neither a full stop nor a comma. And I think that was really provocative. And we were wondering if you could elaborate on a little bit on that, like full stop and comma. What do you
Okay.
uh,
Well,
what do you mean by that for our general audience? Like, how would you interpret that?
well, what I was trying to do there was suggest that if we, at the beginning of the article, I sort of try and create this metaphor for a political transition as being rather like the writing of a text. And of course, that lends itself well to this topic because, what was being produced was a text, a constitution. So um, if we think about change as the creation of a text, then it's punctuated, isn't it? A text is punctuated. So if the text was developing in a particular direction at the point when the earthquake happened, did it stop? Did that direction stop with a full stop and get replaced by a new direction, or was there just a comma? So a sort of a pause before the text continued to be produced in the way that it had been before the earthquake. And there's this theoretical model about what happens politically after a major disaster. That there is this critical juncture at which it's like everything is kind of thrown up in the air for a short period of time, and there's a question about whether those pieces are going to come down in exactly the same form as previously, or whether there's going to be an opportunity for someone to leap in and rearrange them before they hit the ground again. Or whether actually after a disaster there will be what is also called an acceleration of the status quo. So there will be actually a reinforcing of some elements of the situation that preceded the disaster. So the question I was trying to ask was, how does the Nepal experience measure up to or fit into this model of the critical juncture? Was there a complete change of direction, or was there a reinforcement of the previous direction, or even a kind of regression? And I suppose my answer, which is only a very tentative one because it's such a complex question, such a complex situation, is that it's neither, and that actually maybe this model is simple and elegant because it doesn't get sort of messed up in the messy details of the realities of such a situation. Or maybe Nepal is just so complicated and fraught that simple models just don't work there. I don't know, but I think what I sort of concluded was that it was mixed, and that what actually happened was that this metaphor maybe didn't work so well. Maybe we need to think about the earthquake having been a lens that kind of bent the light through itself, or it sort of made things sort of swerve in all sorts of different directions, so that you had the sort of progressive stuff like the federal system, but you didn't have the Madeishi only provinces, and you also had what was seen as regressive legislation on citizenship, particularly in the light of gender differentiation and so on. So yeah, sorry, that's a rather long answer to an interesting question, but I think as you say, it was really trying to take a simple model and show how it has to be made much more complex to actually explain ground realities, at least in this case.
Yeah. Thank you. And now that for example, the Dharara has been rebuilt, and we've seen the inauguration, a huge ceremony that the government of Nepal did. Do you see these kind of it taking these dynamics taking a new direction? Has anything changed at all? These like after these the kind of issues that the disaster uncovered as the reconstruction is going on, do they take new direction, or what happens to the issues that the disasters kind of brought to the fore when it actually occurred? Do they change at all?
I think, I mean, people are beginning to forget the earthquake. It's kind of fading back into history, although it's 6 years ago, because so much has happened since, really, in Nepal
Mhm.
and the world more generally. Um, not just the pandemic, which is only the last year, but in the time leading up to that, the
Mhm.
actual implementation of the constitution, the general election, the election of a majority communist government, and then everything that's happened since with all that kind of falling apart. So it maybe we were giving it more significance at the time than it really deserved. But I would still say that what one of the outcomes of the earthquake, and we need to be careful not to call the earthquake a disaster, because disasters happen in aftermaths, and disasters are human
Mhm.
creations,
Mhm.
they're not natural events. But
Mhm.
the aftermath of the earthquake does did produce, in my view, a kind of an upsurge in the kind of hill nationalism that was of great benefit to um, you know Prime Minister Oli as he became, and the UML in particular,
Mhm.
so that perhaps the process of reconciliation to some extent between Madeish and Bahar that had been going on was somewhat unbalanced by that, and then we saw the blockade and so on as a result. And there's still a legacy of that, I think.
Mhm.
Um, and for me, the Darhara was is very interesting about the way that it was so very quickly adopted as an icon,
Mhm.
and then in the face of great political sort of controversy and so on, there was insistence on rebuilding it sort of to much bigger than it was before, huge expense and so on. And a lot of Nepali friends sort of hate it with a passion, and are
Mhm.
sort of rather bewildered that I was so interested in the Darhara, as if they thought I liked it. It wasn't that I liked it particularly. I just thought it was significant and interesting, and in some ways symbolic of a change that was coming as a result of the earthquake.
Mhm. Yeah. We were also reading one of the other recent publications, the one that you published in Journal of Popular Communication on earthquake after songs, and it's such a fascinating paper, and you analyze various forms of music videos that were published in the aftermath of the Nepal earthquake. And you also talk about the role of Nepali diaspora in producing such kind of artistic expression, and also their role as the audience of these materials. Um, you've done quite a lot of work, and your engagement with a Nepali diaspora has been also quite long standing. How do you see the role of diaspora in engaging with disasters in their home country, and especially in terms of the change and continuity discourse that you've just very elegantly explored and explained just now?
Um, yeah, I mean, I think it's very interesting now that you know when we think about Nepali cultural production, like the videos you mentioned,
Mhm.
in which they can travel abroad so freely, and that the sort of geographical and political boundaries are now almost sort of meaningless for that kind of production. So there's a kind of global Nepali public sphere, and I sort of think back to when I was much younger and I was doing my PhD and I was working on Nepali literature, and all the texts and all the books I was looking at were printed books written mainly by Bowns and Newars, and almost always by men, you know,
Mhm.
in editions of like 500 copies. It was gathered dust for many years, but now people write a poem or a song or whatever, they put it on YouTube, and immediately there's 2 million people looking at it.
Mm.
So I mean, I haven't really engaged as much as I would like with the Nepali diaspora in the UK. Um, I'd hope to do more with the diaspora here when I finished my duties at SOAS, but for obvious reasons, we haven't been able to move about and so on. But I remember, I don't know if you were there, either of you were there on the day. A few days after the earthquake in 2015, there was this huge gathering of Nepalis in Trafalgar Square in the centre of London,
Mhm.
to express solidarity with Nepal after the earthquake, which was amazing. I think it was about 3,000 Nepalis there, and it was very, very moving. And it was so one of the things it's sort of a little depressing that so many people, so many conversations you have in Nepal are with people who want to leave, who sort of see their chances as, being the main chance of in life is going abroad, either for education or employment. But it's also really heartening that when Nepalis have left Nepal, they still have a very strong sense of identification with Nepal.
I just wanted to follow up on your point about the 2015 earthquake, which you mentioned that many people seem to have forgotten that. And to me, that is really interesting, and probably part of the reason is also, as you also indicated, that people are forced to kind of confront reoccurring crisis, and the one that we are seeing right now with the COVID-19 crisis. Of course, our thoughts with our friends and family in the country that we love. In Nepal, the way it is unfolding, the second wave in particular, and I think we understand it's quite early to tell or interpret the longer-term impacts of this ongoing public health crisis. But just based on your preliminary observation, how does it compare with the 2015 Nepal earthquake? I mean, in terms of its socio-political impacts, have you been following it? Or, just your preliminary thoughts on how it's short-term or long-term, how it's going to impact Nepali society?
Well, in fact, Ramesh, I mean, a Nepali colleague and I did put together a major research proposal for the European Research Council.
Oh, brilliant. Yeah.
On COVID-19 in Nepal, and with a particular aspect at looking at the way in which it may or may not produce counter-publics. So we were proposing to not only look at sort of media discourse and so on the way in which COVID-19 and the response to it was being portrayed and constructed, but also do some sort of field work and interview-based work with two categories of people, one being returned migrant workers, and the second being people working in the health sector, particularly at the sort of more lowly levels of kind of cleaners and so on. But unfortunately, we didn't get funding for that. So we now have this huge project proposal that hasn't got anywhere to go. So I'm hoping that there may be an opportunity to do something along those lines in some shape or form, maybe on a smaller scale later in the course of the pandemic, which I hope will be over soon, but I think it's likely to be around for a little while longer. I suppose the difference between this, the COVID-19, the pandemic, sort of defies those boundaries. There's the temporal boundary and the spatial boundary of a conventional disaster like an earthquake. An earthquake is an event, happens in a place, and then apart from aftershocks and so on, hopefully that's it. So you can divide that into pre-event, post-event, and then you can pick up the pieces and begin to rebuild and reconstruct and so on. So you can divide it into event and aftermath, but you can't do that with a pandemic that crosses boundaries, that isn't in one place, that has been going on for some time, will go on for longer. We don't know for how long. So there's that big difference there. But there's also a similarity, I think. Although a pandemic is a global thing by definition, that's why we call it a pandemic, with a complex nature, the experience of the pandemic is still local. It's still the individual human being, the household, the village, the town, the street, whatever. And it still has, it seems to me, I was listening to Chandra Kishore this morning talking about the situation in and around Birganj in the Martin Chautari seminar, and it's clear that just like any other disaster, it can expose underlying sort of structures of inequality. It can encourage nationalism and xenophobia. The people will begin to see others as threats, sources of infection. It can reinforce the kind of distance, the social distancing thing, or the Bautic distancing, as they call it in Nepali. Is like going back to the whole kind of chua-chut kind of thing. Keep away, don't touch people. And also sort of authoritarian trends in leadership, or irresponsible leadership, or denials, or so just I suppose that the pandemic, though, unlike an earthquake, is an ongoing thing, so it'll grind on and on and on. So it can lay bare these fractures and these inequalities over a longer period, and so is potentially much more damaging. It's also a harder thing for an individual society. We were saying earlier how it's exposed this global inequality of the vaccinated and the unvaccinated from country to country, and the fact that so many countries don't have access to vaccines at present, that we need a global conversation, a global solution to this, because it's all very well sitting in the UK feeling safe and vaccinated, but no one is really safe until everybody's safe, and we can begin to meet and interact again as we did before. After a cataclysmic event like an earthquake and the aftermath of that, Nepal can go to the international community and say, we need help with this. Nepal at that stage is the only country making that kind of request. But obviously we're in a situation now where so many different countries are in the same position.
Right.
It's unlikely that the international donor community is going to be able to resolve all of this. It's a bigger question, and a bigger solution is required.
Yeah, I think it also links to Uma's earlier question about diaspora's role, because I was also talking to some friends and colleagues in Nepal, and they were saying that one of the differences, which we could also, as someone from Nepal or someone who loves Nepal, can relate to, because after the 2015 earthquake, there was also an influx of a lot of Nepalis living abroad, like diaspora, going back to Nepal to contribute to sort of response and humanitarian aid and mobilizing resources, which we cannot do now. It's just physically impossible to go and contribute, and here we are even not able to see our loved ones, and I think that's a really kind of major seems difference between these, which you were saying about this spatial kind of nature of the two disasters, I guess.
There's a paper I've been working on for some time, which I hope to finish one day, which is trying to do an analysis of the volunteer surge that happened in the early weeks of the 2015 aftermath. Involved, there's a guy I know in London, Nepali, who went back and spent over a year, I think, working in Gorkha district and so on. So I was interviewing him and getting his experiences, and a number of other people. So that was very interesting, and that also didn't seem to have a political impact. So it all kind of got soaked up by the NGO networks in due course. But as an initial response, that kind of volunteer surge, a volunteer wave, and a lot of, as you say, diaspora involvement was very significant.
Right.
Yeah, and we are now coming to an end of our conversation. But before we close, it would be really nice to know your thoughts on the possibilities and shortcomings in disaster studies in Nepal, and also what would be your advice to early career researchers in Nepal and beyond who wants to study disasters?
I suppose, for several of us, as old Nepal hands, we sort of entered this disaster studies world as a new world, and found out a lot about it. And there are lots of disaster studies programs and centres all around the world. I think it's a little bit of a growth area. I don't think disaster studies is a discipline by itself. I think of it more as a kind of field. Many disciplines can contribute. So I think it's important to have as many disciplines that can help us to understand human, social, and political life engaged in the field of disaster studies as possible, including ones that, researchers who have their feet very much in the ground of particular places. There's Mark Lichty and I have written the introduction to this book, and we've talked about the way in which, actually, I think I can probably find you a quote of it somewhere. It is, so we say it is the disaster affected people themselves, individually and collectively, who work to build new lives, sometimes with and sometimes against the efforts of the outsiders who come to assist them. It's not just homes and other infrastructure that must be reconstructed. People must rebuild their lives and livelihoods, their senses of self, their edifices of meaning, and so on. So I think the point we're making is that, you know, the aftermath involves human beings trying to create a future, reconstruct the present, and imagine a new future. And to be helped to do that, they need people to be there who understand the context of their sense of self and what their needs are in terms not only of physical reconstruction, but also in terms of the kinds of society they want to live in, the kinds of culture they want to have. So, I mean, so I think if you want to be a disaster studies specialist, that's great. But I would say that rather than rushing out to study disaster studies in the first instance, you should probably study politics or sociology, or even maybe literature and language and culture. It doesn't really matter, because I think everyone can contribute to understanding disasters.
That's a really nice note on which to end. Thank you so much for your time and insights, Michael. We really appreciate it.